As a mother, wife, and divorce attorney for over 15 years, experience has taught me a lot about how to deal with times of uncertainty, transition, and facing opportunities for growth. I'm happy you're joining me for this part of the journey. When parents part ways, they often encounter many challenges that can make the co-parenting relationship very difficult. Whether it's a difference in opinions over parenting values or household operations, bedtimes, vaccinations, whatever the host of issues are, it can be incredibly difficult to co-parent in a way that's healthy. One tool that's available to help many parents who are encountering these kinds of challenges is to bring in a parenting facilitator or parenting coordinator. Here to talk with me today about the role of the parenting facilitator and or parenting coordinator is Kathleen Scofield. Kathleen has a practice here in Dallas where she works with families, and will provide more details about her practice in the notes below. And I just want to say, Kathleen, welcome, and thank you so much for taking time to come talk with us today about how we can help parents be better parents for their children.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm really glad to be here today.
As we start off talking, tell us a little bit about how you got involved in working with families who are going through divorce or separation.
Sure. So this is actually a second career for me. I had the fortunate luck to meet probably the original and first parenting facilitator in our area, many years ago. I worked with Carrie Beard for about 5 years, kind of all the way through graduate school and as her practicum student. And I really got a glimpse of, it's a very interesting intersection between law, which I think is incredibly interesting, and therapy. So kind of, over the years have done a lot of training with different, individuals, but then also have done some of my own studies into why, we fight, why we have conflict, how it perpetuates, to really develop my own style. So
that is great. So you and I know about the role of parenting facilitator and parenting coordinator, but a lot of parents who are watching today may not be familiar with these terms at all. Can you give us a brief description of what each of those roles are and how they differ?
Sure. That's actually, I hear that a lot. Parents go, I didn't know that you existed. I didn't know this role existed. We need this. It's going to be really helpful. So a parenting facilitator is a neutral and unbiased professional that has received really specific training in this area, training in basic mediation, advanced family law mediation, parenting facilitation and coordination, and domestic violence. And we're included somewhere in a court order, whether that's temporary order, a mediated settlement agreement, or a final decree. And we're put in place to help really stabilize the co-parenting core. We try and help improve communication, make it more business-like and professional. We do provide accountability. We do expect that the decree is going to be followed, the court order is going to be followed, and sometimes we need to provide accountability that everybody is adhering to agreements that have been made. And then we do provide documentation that can be helpful later on down the road if we need to report to the court kind of what's transpiring between two parents. So really, we're trying to exact a change, trying to make things better and more productive, help them navigate through that rocky period that sometimes exists prior, during, and after divorce and separation, and make things a little better for the children.
So it sounds like in parenting facilitation, what I'm hearing you say is, first of all, there's a court order in place, and then that gives the structure and accountability as you help the parents navigate through some of the issues that they're having.
Yes, that's correct. And then we also do have the ability to, send status memos to the court if we need to, as requested by either side. We can be called to testify in court if needed, to provide, again, the court with additional information about what's transpiring between these two individuals. So that's very clearly in the facilitator role.
So then what is the parenting coordinator role, and how is that different?
It is similar in that I'm going to engage in the same therapeutic approach and style. I am going to work to help them communicate, come to agreements, mediate decisions. I really want to keep everybody out of constant litigation as much as I can. But the parent coordinator is a confidential process. So I can, be called to court. I don't release the file. I don't send status memos to the court. We're basically either either meeting or we're not meeting. So that would be for parents who do want to keep this process confidential, but still want the weight of the court order there.
So how do you help parents, or maybe the lawyers who are working with the parents, decide whether or not it's better for this family to have parent coordination or a parent facilitator?
It's a difficult point. I think if there is future, litigation, or maybe we've got pending litigation, at times I will work with parents before the divorce is finalized because they are really struggling to co-parent even in the midst of this. So I think if we've got significant issues with adherence to the court order, we've got, problems with one or both parents, sticking to agreements. If there is the need for future litigation, which sometimes is a possibility, I think the facilitator is definitely the role, that needs to be utilized at that point.
When is a good time to bring in a parenting facilitator or coordinator?
That's a really good question. And I think that really does depend on what is transpiring within the family, within the parents. If the children are starting to become the center of the conflict, they're aware of it, they're hearing a lot of adult information, they're getting caught in the middle, we start to see the children suffering from maybe some psychological or behavioral issues. I really think that implementation at that point for that neutral party to come in and really try and work with the parents would be really beneficial. But, sometimes people divorce pretty well, and then a year or two down the road, we encounter some issues, and, the parents decide, hey, we've really got a lot of conflict. We're not working well together. We need to come to someone, who will help us stabilize.
So another term I think that is used a lot for helping families reach resolution is a mediator. And you talked about mediation training as part of your training. But how does your role as a facilitator differ from, say, a mediator?
Well, I believe, the mediator is just utilized in one, block of time, one chunk of time, and then it's done. And with a parent facilitator, I'm going to meet with them as long as I need to until that co-parenting core and communication is stabilized. And I actually think it's a really good tool to place a parent facilitator in there so that the parents have someone to come to before they kind of rush back to court or need to contemplate litigation. So I work really hard to stabilize, get them on maybe an as needed basis. But, I mean, teenagers are hard. You got lots of developmental challenges that come with, the different age groups. And I think they bring different kinds of conflict to the parents. So I think it's good to have someone that you can come to, that will help you to kind of stabilize, that knows your case, that you can work with intermittently if you need it.
So is one of your goals then in working with family to help them find resolution to some of those burning issues?
Yes. The Texas Family Code is pretty clear in, what a parent facilitator's boundaries are. So we're never going to have an opinion or position on, some of the bigger rights like, primary residence, rights and duties and responsibilities for decision making, parenting time, custody and access. But some of these other things, we definitely can help to kind of say, hey, look at it from a different angle, or how is this affecting your children, or, how are your children feeling? So we can, there's so many other things that they argue about.
There are lots of things. What are some of the most common things that you hear in your role as parenting facilitator that people are having a hard time making decisions about?
Well, most recently it has honestly been, a lot surrounding COVID and vaccinations and what quarantine looks like and masks and things of that nature. I think it is not uncommon for parents to have, differing positions. And like, for example, if a child is exposed at one home, but 2 or 3 days later is supposed to go to the other home, what do we do? So those are things where I try and orchestrate, some type of compromise. If one parent is going to miss some time, where can we make that up? Things of that nature. And And frankly, sometimes it's just as small as like haircuts and, sports equipment and decisions about extracurricular activities and, things of that nature. So it really kind of spans the board.
So how does it work? How do you take two people who have polar opposites, because opposites do attract, which is good for both you and me, but they do. So how do we take people of polar opposites and help them find resolution? And I always stop and say, because people need to understand, going to a judge is one means of resolution, right? Yeah. You can have a third party who's making the decision, who won't know your family as well and know all the ins and outs. So how does it work?
Well, I think you just made a really interesting point about the judge, because when you go to court, you do have a limited time, and a lot of times when people come and see me, they feel like they've never been able to kind of really flesh out and share their story. So the first thing that I do is I meet with each parent individually to kind of hear the relevant history, but I do want to establish a rapport and trust in a relationship, because a central part of parent facilitation is I'm going to challenge each parent. There's going to be points where they like me and they don't like me, and that's okay, because I've earned their trust that when I do challenge them, it's in the best interest of their children. So that's kind of the first thing that I do is, hey, I want to meet everyone. I want them to get to know my style and approach, answer questions. I want to earn their trust. And then once I've done that, I bring them back together for joint sessions. And those usually occur every couple of weeks, where I like it to stay very agenda driven, very solutions focused. We're learning different ways to communicate. And I think that's the hardest part, is pulling them out of that cycle of kind of what I'd say conflictual or poor communication that doesn't lead to any deeper understanding or solutions or agreements. So I think the other big piece outside of challenging is we need to provide people with education and some understanding about what I think is happening to help them pull them out of kind of that cycle of, husband and wife, exes, that umbrella, that hat, and into more of a workable co-parenting relationship.
So you just talked about kind of the cycle of communication. So let's help us understand this, because when you go to have children, nobody gives you the handbook that says, here's how to be an effective parent with the other person. We're operating off of, probably how we were raised in many circumstances. And that's playing out, the things my parents did well, the things they didn't do well. But you have two people who are coming from completely different world experiences. So help us understand what some of these cycles are.
So I think the first one that I talk about a little bit is the starts of what I would call conflictual communication, or this triangle. And I actually draw it up on a whiteboard in my office, but it is what was said and what was heard and what was meant. And a lot of times in between two people, especially two people who have been arguing for a while, there's a lot of assumption of intent. So what one person said was not necessarily what the other person heard. They may have heard something different, and the meaning behind what is being discussed is lost and frankly different between the two people. So I help people by saying, okay, parent, tell me what you just heard, or tell me what you just said or meant. And I encourage them before they escalate and react to ask more questions. This is what I heard you say. Is this what you meant? Or I'm watching you escalate and get upset. Tell me what you heard me say. Then we start to understand the nuances behind what people are hearing. We get them to always ask for more information before, again, escalating and reacting. And I tell people in communication, we need to avoid three things: escalation, defensiveness, accusation. The minute any one or all three of those come into our conversation, we've lost our ability to be productive. And I say that consistently. So that triangle of first asking questions before we escalate, or asking for more information to better understand. Listen to understand instead of listen to react.
Okay, but why should I listen to understand? I know what he's been saying for all these years, or what she's been saying, and I'm done. I don't want to understand. Like, what is the importance of understanding? How is that beneficial for me? I understand it might be good for the other person, but what's in it for me?
Well, I think you just hit on a really important focus, which is we have to remove the focus between the two parents and put it back on the children. And that's the problem, is everybody comes in with a very fixed narrative and story about who that other person is and the intent behind why they're saying and doing things. I'll listen to that first, to a certain extent, but then, hey, we've got to push them out of that narrative to say, if I say and do this, I need to ask myself two questions. How is this going to affect my children? How are my children going to feel about that? So I've got to pull the narrative away from that husband and wife ex umbrella, and we've got to put it under the co-parenting hat to say, wait a moment, my focus needs to be my children. I can keep fighting with my co-parent, but that's going to have some really negative effects on my children. I need to do what's in the best interest of the children, not what I'm feeling in that moment.
So let's talk about that for a minute, because it is something that I'm very aware of. And, I think for any lawyer who's worked with families in conflict, we see what happens with kiddos in the midst of conflict. As a therapist, what is going on with children who are experiencing a lot of conflict between the parents?
It can be a combination. We see a couple of different things. I think, just kind of the foundation, we see anxiety, depression, a lot of signs and symptoms. You see some behavioral issues. They may be acting out in school. They may be struggling with their friendships, with their peer group. Maybe they're not sleeping, having some issues with eating and with food. But then if we dig a little bit deeper, there's a little bit of these traps that children will fall into, especially when they start to get, enough adult information where, they think in terms of black and white and right or wrong. So they may want to fix the issue. They want to manage their parents' emotions. They may want to figure out who's right and who's wrong. They may take sides. All of those things not only have devastating effects on children in that moment, but they will reverberate into later years. And I do work a lot with I would say children of high conflict divorce, but they're adults now. They're in their 20s, their 30s. They're falling into some of the same patterns. They're engaging in some of the same conflict. They're also having some trust and attachment issues in their adult relationships, whether that be intimate or friendships. So the things that parents are doing now that are affecting the children, they need to remember that they will have long-lasting effects much later into their adulthood, and then also when they become a parent. And that's where I really try and put that focus back on the children to say, hey, it isn't just about how your children are doing right now. These are things that are going to be a part of their adulthood. They're going to have to fight or work through at some point, which to me is it's really sad.
It is, but as I'm listening to you talk, I'm also thinking about how very natural it is as we kind of shift, without awareness, without education. I think our default programming it is to create an environment that can be so damaging for children. So I'll tell you, so here's what I'm sitting here listening to you talk about is, I know as a parent, there are things that I believe are right for my children. And if I'm going to come into you to see you, I might have to hear that maybe what I'm thinking about isn't right. And so, but if I don't change my way of thinking about this, then the risk is that my children are going to pay the price for that. Yeah. So I can be right all day, but if it's hurting my children, then what's the value of being right?
I think I hear that a lot, that I'm right, they're wrong. Again, it's that rigidity, that black and white type of thinking. And I actually subscribe to conflict existing a little bit more in the gray. Sometimes I'll talk with parents and clients to say, hey, outside of just the normal things that we have conflict of, I think we actually fight about two different concepts. And the first one is unmet expectations. And where that really hits home for divorce and high conflict families is I hear all the time, well, I thought things would be so much better when we separated and got divorced. Like, I thought we'd be parenting so much better. But the fact of the matter is that you're still this the same people, and you still probably have some of the same dysfunctional communication styles. So that expectation that's unmet, where we thought everything was going to be so much better, and it's not, can leave us with a lot of anger and resentment and frustration. That other piece is this idea of intent, that someone is purposefully doing something to hurt us or to hurt our feelings or to make life difficult, or we're being accused of doing something on purpose. I like to pull away from this idea of right and wrong to say, hey, let's move beyond that, to say what's in the best interest of the children and how can we compromise, because the resolution of conflict is all day always going to be better for the children.
So to really be able to find that resolution, I have to be willing to let go of the need to be right or wrong, right? Or to have the other side be wrong. Usually it's my need to be right and have the other side be wrong. Just saying, I have a little bit of experience in this area. But and listen, this is just like human nature. I mean, it doesn't have to be a spouse. It could be a work person, whatever. But that desire to be right. And we really have to look that there's something more important going on here, which is really to try and understand.
And that's the whole difference between the passive listening versus the active listening. Passive listening is listening with the intent to already respond. And that's where we kind of engage in that verbal volleyball, where we go back and forth. We're not really leading to any sort of agreement or solution. We just want to be right and for them to be wrong. And in reality, that's where a lot of that escalation, that frustration, when we're already going up in a conflict, we're going to lose our ability to be productive. So the active listening is more listening with the intent to understand, to have empathy, to put ourselves in someone else's shoes, and to understand, hey, what are they trying to tell me, and what do I need to do with this? I think right and wrong really needs to be shifted. When we talk about like success in this, it isn't necessarily that I'm the right parent, it's that my children are going to be okay, that my children are removed from the conflict, that we're doing the business of co-parenting and we're doing it well. That to me is being right. So that's where I go.
So I was just going to ask you, what does success look like in working with a parenting facilitator? Are things actually getting resolved? Are decisions being made that, even if both parents aren't fully in agreement, they can still have respect for the decisions? I mean, what does that look like in your office?
I think that's a really good question. I'm not necessarily looking for the absence of conflict, because raising children is really hard. And I feel like it's harder now than it ever has been. I think that there's a lot of demands on parents. What I'm looking for is, can you navigate a conflict? Can you communicate successfully and come to an agreement, without it being World War III, without your children being placed in the middle, without them hearing a lot of adult information. So I think success is, hey, we're doing the business of co-parenting and we're doing it well, and we're not escalating to the point where, we can't come to any sort of agreement.
Okay, so I have to just ask you this, because one of the things I hear often, whether it's from my clients or just out in general, just the world, is we're labeling pathologies. So he's a narcissist. I could never co-parent with him. She's what role does pathology have? Are there some actual bona fide pathologies that make it impossible to co-parent together?
I mean, I'd say yes, but I think a lot of times when we're labeling pathologies in the way that you're kind of sharing with me, we're labeling features. And, research shows that 6 months prior to the separation to 2 years after the decree is signed, that's a very ambiguous window. Because sometimes it takes longer for a court order to be signed. That is the most conflictual time for those parents. And we see features of personalities come out in that period of time where, after the fact, parents go, I can't believe I did that. I can't believe I said that. What was I thinking? It's this tornado. It's this hurricane of a storm that they're in the moment. So, yes, there are pathologies that are very difficult, to work with, a narcissist or a borderline personality disorder, but that needs to come from an actual licensed evaluator I do see people present with features of certain, personality disorders, because I think some of the situation does bring some of that out. I just, I reserve that diagnosis for someone who has actually done a very thorough assessment.
So just because somebody is exhibiting features of, say, a narcissistic personality disorder doesn't mean they have the full-blown disorder. And it could be that, this is what I'm hearing you say, it could be that if we can kind of stabilize the moods and the emotions, that we may be able to move through that, and that they're not always going to be showing up as a raging narcissist.
Now, I will say there is a little caveat to that. There is, it is part of the parent facilitation process where, one or both parents will have a diagnosable personality disorder. So whenever I'm approaching a case or working with parents, my first direction is always to try and exact change in this family system. And I will work very hard to do that. However, there are points where what I am actually doing is providing documentation about what is transpiring and really being able to say to the court, hey, this is what one or both parents are doing, and this is very, very concerning. We either need additional interventions, I need more therapeutic support. We need, to work with this parent in this way. So there are pieces where we do see mental illness and substance abuse actually, accompany some of these high conflict cases. And it's just knowing and working and trying to, provide that accountability and documentation that is needed.
And I think one of the realities that people, need to understand, that I mean, when I'm dealing and working in those cases as well, is that even if the other parent does have a diagnosis, substance abuse or whatever, this is still the parent of your child. So somehow, whether their role is going to be minimized because they, can't control their impulsive behaviors and it's damaging to the child, whatever way that that's going to show up, you're still, as the parent maybe who doesn't have the diagnosis, still going to help your child learn to navigate that relationship because this person is a part of them.
I think it's also important to remember that a child is half one parent and half the other parent. So even if we do have one parent that has some sort of diagnosable mental illness, we still need to help the child manage that. But then also, we don't want to throw the child into any type of identity crisis. So we don't want one parent bad-mouthing the other parent, because ultimately the child's going to go, well, wait, that's half me. Do I have that?
Right.
Is that part of me? Parents will anecdotally say, oh, you're just like your father or your mother does that. Oh, that is a very damaging statement. That kind of stays with a child, kind of creates, again, that inner conflict.
So even if maybe both parents aren't willing to continue to show up for parenting facilitation, is there still value in at least one parent participating in the process, or how does the process, is it a different kind of role that might be a better fit for that parent?
That's an interesting question. So from the parent facilitation front, both parents are court ordered to participate until the facilitator states that they can go on an as needed basis. So if one decides to not participate, then that would be something that I would notify the court in a status memo of, because, let's be honest, the majority of my people do not want to come and sit in the room with their co-parent, and in fact, they'll have individual sessions with me and say, hey, this process is really hard. I get upset. It's difficult for me, but there is so much value in sitting together and communicating and trying to find a different way to navigate some of these issues. So if one parent doesn't participate, that's a problem. One thing I have noticed in my practice is I used to think I needed both people in a room to work through some conflict, and I actually do not. If I have one individual, and this would be a voluntary, private counseling situation, if I give them some of these tools, and there's at least a foundation of some decent communication there, even they will share it with the other person, whether that's a partner or, a family member. They'll share what they're learning in session, and they're bringing something different to the table, which hopefully will prompt the other person to respond and do something different. I have a way where if I'm going to challenge someone or I'm going to have a difficult conversation, I tell them ahead of time, hey, I'm going to say something that might make you a little upset or might make you want to feel defensive, but please know that I think this conversation would be really productive and beneficial for both of us. So stay with me. Let's not get angry. Hear what I'm trying to say. Let's come to some type of. So I do it ahead of time, and I kind of ease them into it a little bit before I kind of challenge or have a crucial conversation.
Have you had success with working with parents and parenting facilitation, and what does that look like?
I have had some success. When you get to a good working place, they do start to release that tension. Now, I will be honest, it's harder when there's active pending litigation. I get a lot more success when things are kind of done and they're settled, and it's like, okay, let's put everything back together and let's go down a different road, and let's communicate a little bit more effectively. When there's pending litigation or active, or we've got something that has really escalated, sometimes that's got to be resolved before I really start to get us into the active working phase. So I definitely do get some success.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I guess it's just the questions I ask that is like, well, what is success? Mm-hmm. And it sounds like from what you've been telling us, it's really focused on the children.
Yes.
Really, the children being able to navigate the relationship with both parents.
There is a very dangerous and kind of tricky narrative that a lot of people just naturally engage in. It's this cycle where we justify our actions and our communication and our behaviors as a response or reaction to the other person. And what I hear a lot is, well, but they did this, so then I did that. Right. Well, I never would have done that if they hadn't done this. Therefore, I'm going to very quickly absolve myself of that accountability and responsibility. I'm going to put it back on the parent that I think started it. That's one of the biggest cycles that leads to success. If we can break that cycle to say, you are responsible for your behavior, your communications, how it's affecting the children outside of whatever your co-parent is doing. We've got to break that justification and hold everybody accountable for what they're doing and what they're bringing to the table.
And really, when you do that, you restore somebody's power, because it is a really miserable place to live when the other person is controlling your behaviors and your responses.
I hear parents say a lot, I kind of know how we got here, but we're so far in this deep conflict, I have no idea how to get us out of it. Because again, we get kind of triggered by our co-parent. Maybe they say something, we respond and we react, we justify our communication and behavior as a reaction to them. But by the way, our reaction and response becomes their triggering behavior. So now we go round and round where they're always blaming the other person. It's always the other person's fault. And again, when we remove the focus from the parents and put it on the children, then we start putting them as the focus. How is it going to make my children feel? How is it going to affect my children?
And you get to reclaim your own power and really claim your role in your relationship with your children. And the other parent can be who they're going to be.
Exactly.
But no longer does that sideways glare or the heavy breath or whatever does that trigger you. Right?
I think it's also really confusing for children. If there was conflict before the divorce and now there's conflict after, well, what was the point of all of this? Because this was supposed to make it better and it didn't. Versus if you have conflict before, you're able to achieve a good working co-parenting relationship that's actually an improvement, and the children aren't around that. They also will watch you go into hopefully healthier relationships. That can be very reaffirming for the children to say, hey, I understand. Both of my parents are good people. They just weren't great together, and that's okay, and I get that.
And that is a wonderful thing. I mean, I certainly know, I have many peers who will say that about their family's divorce. Not enough. I mean, I think in the midst of the pain of the conflict and the pain of the transition is an incredible opportunity to learn some new skills.
Yes. Yeah. And I think you hit something really great before when you said, hey, sometimes some of these are learned reactions or responses, maybe going back into our own childhood. And, I don't think we did divorce real great many years ago, 80s, 90s, we split kids up and things of that nature. And we didn't have the therapeutic support that we have now. And so I do see a lot of people parents now that were products of high conflict divorce then, and they become very emotional, and their ability to be intelligent, to use higher like logic and critical thinking tends to go down when we're emotional, and we tend to reach for either learned behavior or communication, either from childhood or maybe from, past experience in that relationship.
So there's opportunity in the midst of, one of the most painful times in life to really take back your power, stop blaming the other side, and really pave a future forward for you and your children. And I love that.
I think one of the best things that we can do for our children is set the example of, look, we had conflict, but we worked it out. Or both parents contributed to this. Both parents apologized. There's so much value in demonstrating to that to your children. And I think there's also, it's amazing for your children to watch you grow, to watch you work hard at something, to watch that resolution. I think that is something that really would stay with them and be a wonderful example for years to come.
A tremendous gift that we'll keep giving.
I agree.
I love that.
I agree.
As we wrap up today, Kathleen, what is your message of hope for parents who right now are living in that space of conflict, living with that heartache?
I would say that it is a chunk of work, to navigate going from the relationship of exes to the relationship of co-parents. But if you're in the middle of that high conflict situation, I know that it takes a toll on your mental and emotional health. I know it takes a toll on your ability to navigate relationships in a healthy way. I know that stress, anxiety, and depression is way up. And when you start to work through this in a productive way, that some of that actually will resolve and come down. Like, you'll feel better, because it doesn't feel good to be in the middle of this tornado, in the middle of this hurricane. And it really does take a toll on us mentally and emotionally. And there is some peace on the other side once you get to a place that's a little bit more working and not so high conflict. I think I hear a lot of people say all of this really takes a toll, and they just want it to be better.
I love that. Thank you so much for your time. If you want to learn more about Kathleen and about her practice and the work that she's doing to help families navigate the difficulties of conflict, we will include a link to all of her information below, and I hope you'll reach out to contact her. She's a great resource for our families. Thank you so much. We'll see you next time.